Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us on the inaugural episode of our third season of Canada Files. I'm Jim Deeks, and I'm very happy to say that our first guest of the season is someone familiar to all our viewers, I'm sure. Ashleigh Banfield, currently the anchor and producer of the primetime news program Banfield on the NewsNation cable network throughout the United States, and a veteran journalist and anchor previously on MSNBC, NBC, and CNN. Ashleigh is a native of Winnipeg, Manitoba, and just another in a long line of distinguished Canadian-born international news correspondents. Ashleigh Banfield, thank you so much for joining us on Canada Files, and thanks for joining us from your Banfield studio.
Jim, it's great to see you. Thank you so much for the invitation. What an absolutely charming way to start my day.
It's a pleasure for us. And you know, I just introduced you by saying you are one of a long line of distinguished Canadian news correspondents. And I wonder if you're aware personally of some of the famous Canadians who have been successful on U.S. television, and if any of them have had any influence on you?
It's a great question. And in fact, yes, the biggest, Peter Jennings. When I was traveling my way around the world in 1991, I had a stopover in Moscow when it was still Soviet Union. And Peter Jennings was there for a summit with, at the time it wasn't Yeltsin, that was Gorbachev. And so I sneaked my way into the convention area with a made-up ID and asked if I could volunteer and work for ABC. And they said, sure, we'll take a free hand. And I ended up working directly with Peter. And for that, he rewarded me with a line on my resume saying, for reference, call. I think it was very helpful.
Well, you know, unlike many journalists, you came from a pretty prominent family in Winnipeg. Give us just a little bit of detail on your upbringing and education.
So I always thought it was pretty nondescript. You know, Winnipeg is one of those places that you might only know for the Winnipeg Jets. But it's a great place to grow up, minus the minus 40 in February. But I was really fortunate. I had a great upbringing. I went to public school and private school. I had a mom who was a tour de force, who was a real estate broker owning her own firm with some partners, all women, back in the 70s when women barely worked. So I had this great modeling in my household where women could be the head of household. They could be the breadwinners and could be highly respected and still be feminine and delightful, which was what my mom was. And so, you know, I sort of took my lessons mostly from her. And then, of course, that just incredibly resounding community that Winnipeg is. I mean, they really are a village that supports their own. And so all throughout my travels through Canada in broadcasting, and then, of course, down through the United States, I've maintained that little piece of Winnipeg DNA.
You went to university, and as I understand it, you primarily majored in French. But what sparked the interest in television?
So it's a great question, and I think I'm one of the luckiest people in the world because I had an epiphany very early in life. It was for the Americans watching ninth grade, for the Canadians watching grade 9. And I was sitting in Mrs. Sharp's history class, and she was talking about the British history curriculum, which isn't the most enthralling, curriculum for a ninth grader, but at the same time, King John and the Magna Carta, I thought, who wrote all this down? Who was the first person to see all of this? Who actually had eyes on, the Magna Carta? I want to be that guy. I want to be the guy that gets to tell everybody, because you'll be important, you'll matter, you'll be relevant, and you'll have a stake in history. And at the time I didn't realize it, but that's literally news before it's history. So I had made that commitment early on at age 14. That's what I want to do. I think in the back of my mind I was watching a lot of Beirut on the CBC News with Knowlton Nash and was thinking that foreign correspondence would be a pretty exciting way to exercise my foreign language muscles, my interest in current events, my performance capacity, and then of course this incredible opportunity to be the scribe of history.
Well, looking over your resume, you've now worked for many of the top news organizations in the United States, NBC, MSNBC, CNN, and now NewsNation. But you also seem to have had some ups and downs along the way. Tell us about your career path, not in full detail, but just along the way, and whether some of those downs were pretty down for you.
Sure, you'd need a Netflix series for me to get in depth on that one. But if you are in the television business and you have not had the prodigious peaks and the devastating valleys, I don't know where you're working, but it's a job I've never seen. For me, yeah, I've had some really life-shaking downs, devastating, where there's nothing like waking up to the front cover of the business section of the New York Times saying that you're a loser. I think they use more articulate language than that, but yeah, I've had a really interesting path. And you mentioned a little earlier that lots of Canadian journalists would love to be working in the US. Well, that's great, but put on your elephant skin and get your resilience, fine-tuned, because it is a really difficult career. It's difficult physically, it's difficult mentally. You don't sleep, your eating is terrible, but it's extraordinarily rewarding at the same time. It's a little like childbirth. Why on earth would we do that twice? But yeah, so I took some stands early after my foreign correspondence, saying the media shouldn't be jingoistic and cheering on a war effort. We're not on a team. This is not a sport. And quickly realized that jingoism kind of sometimes is the name of the game if you're going into war in a big country like America. And it didn't serve me well to try to be outspoken about being unbiased. Go figure. But that was a lesson learned. Not that I would change anything. I would never change anything. What I found to be very bizarre was that it seemed to be twisted, and again, the details perhaps weren't digested enough by the management at the time, that I was criticizing my own colleagues. Nothing could have been further from the truth. I was extraordinarily proud of NBC's coverage and MSNBC and my team. My Lord, I've never seen anybody more committed to journalism and at their own personal risk. When I was overseas with my team. But for whatever reason, the management of NBC thought that I was critical of NBC people. It wasn't true, and I think I got taken to the woodshed for that.
While we're still on the subject of your ups and downs, I wonder if there wasn't a time during the downs when you might have thought, I should just chuck it all and go back to Winnipeg or Toronto, where you might well have easily landed a major network role based on your success to that point in American television, but you hung in there instead of coming back to Canada. But did it occur to you to maybe do that?
It's interesting. That's a great question. There was at one point in my career early, I thought, maybe I should get with the program. Maybe I'm not cut out for this. I keep getting kicked in the teeth. And I took the Canadian Securities course thinking, my brother's been really successful. Maybe I have some talent here too. That was one of my worst decisions in life, although I'm happy to have completed that course and I have some financial knowledge because of it. But I was never cut out to be a broker. I was never cut out to be in the financial markets. I was never cut out to do anything except exactly what I'm doing. And so for that reason, no, I hung in there because I knew I had chosen the right path, because I know I love it. I know I'm committed to it. I know I'm good at it. Those are the things in the cocktail that you must have in order to mix a great drink. And I knew that if I just had a little more resilience and a little more thick skin, that I could continue to succeed in the business.
Talking about resilience, you've worked in a number of capacities during your television career. You've been a field reporter, an international correspondent. You've been an anchor, an interviewer, a legal specialist, a crime specialist. Are there any, or is there any one of those aspects that you've actually found most compelling over the years?
So add to the list a managing editor and a producer. And frankly, everybody does this job a little different, but I am at heart a producer. And I start my day, I spend the first 10 hours of my day before I'm even on air producing. And I think that makes a good anchor, because who are you to be bringing this material to the public if you haven't got your fingers dirty in it first, or figured what matters and gotten to the details. I always say the devil's in the details. So if you didn't catch those details, shame on you, you know. But I think producer has been the person who has served me best inside. The rest of it has been a lot of window dressing, and yeah, okay, I'm a good performer, but I think the producing is actually where I find my most skill. Just not in keeping a rundown and a live time. I was terrible in headsets in the control room. I always made the poor sports guy. I always ate up like 3 minutes of his time, and he was always so mad.
Ashleigh, what's the most difficult or compelling story you've ever worked on in these roughly 25 years in American television?
You know, I would be foolish not to say 9/11, because I think a lot of people who worked that day will say the same thing. I had a particularly unique experience in that I was actually under the North Tower when it fell. So I saw my life flash before my eyes, and I feared that I was dying. And that is a very profound experience. I've been in other situations where I've been fearful, facing down Taliban soldiers who were 14 years old, hopped up on heroin with a knockoff Kalashnikov pointed at my head, laughing. That's scary. But for whatever reason, I didn't feel like I was about to die in those circumstances. I felt like I was going to die on the day of 9/11. And I also felt like the lifeline to the world was lost, because phone lines couldn't get out. No one knew where I was. And I thought the building that I had found refuge in the collapse of the North Tower was about to come down too. So trying to keep it together when your entire person is revolting against you is a tough thing to do, and still do your job. It's funny, people always say, oh, you did such a good job that day. You were the calm in the storm. And I think, who were you watching? I was not calm. I was losing my lunch every minute. I was a bucket of tears most of the times off camera. So I must have put on quite a show that day.
Well, you've recently been sort of in the eye of the storm, a bit of a controversy involving Katie Couric, who we will all remember as the host of NBC Today for about 15 years in the 90s and into the 2000s. But Katie just published an autobiography in which she accused you, basically, of being after her job back in about 2003, when you were, again, a very hot commodity on NBC News. That was her perspective, but I gather you have a very different perspective on that incident.
Well, I do, especially the timeline, because it was the year 2000 when the incidents started to begin. And in the year 2000, you could barely find a headline about me. So I wasn't a big deal. I was one of those sycophantic kids, so to speak, new at NBC who, looked up blinkingly at Katie Couric, thinking, wow, one day, wouldn't it be amazing to be even close to her status, And let me just preface this, Jim, by saying she remains number one in my eyes in morning show hosts. I don't know that there's ever going to be one who will surpass her ability, her guts, her tenacity, and just her talent, like her sheer talent. She was a force to be reckoned with on morning television. Her statistics speak for themselves. And I have always long admired her ability to do that, especially at a time when women were supposed to be, I don't know, a female version of Cronkite, and even then you were mocked. There she went and said, I'm doing it my way. I'm going to be funny and adorable and hilarious and me and authentic, and I got this crazy smile, and I'm not going to hide it. And I thought that was extraordinarily brave, and I modeled myself in ways after Katie Couric. So I disagree with Katie in terms of why she felt the way she did about me, because at the time she was doing things, I was a no one. There was no reason. I wasn't gunning for her job. I was like the associate producer level, and she was, the executive president.
Let's move on from that. I think you would agree that over the decades in television news, both local and national, and in Canada and the United States, television news has been largely populated by attractive and primarily Caucasian women. And I think that's changed quite a bit in the last several years. But I wonder, and let me ask you this, whether good looks and charm are still a prerequisite for women to get jobs on air, generally in television today.
I think generally speaking, you better look presentable, that's for sure. I say that about people going into job interviews too. Comb your hair, fix your face, put on a nice suit, and make a good impression. I think, for audiences, they probably feel the same way. But I think what's overtaken that is authenticity. So gone is the Cronkitean, facade of somebody who has gravitas. And now the more popular model is be endearing, be yourself, be authentic, and be honest. Be honest about your flaws. Be honest about everything. I interviewed Gail King recently for my mentorship program called Rising Tide, and she laughed about a boss telling her butt was too big on the air. And she regularly poses in the bathing suit on a beach at 66 years old, and then she always weighs herself in the 170 pounds range, which women would never, ever do. But Gail is one of the most successful women in television doing exactly that. And then to your point, Gail's a woman of color as well. And I think that was a very poignant thing for her to say, that she never imagined as a woman of color that she would reach these prodigious heights that she has. I had a different track, actually, than a lot of other women, or that the narrative, the most widely accepted narrative would be. And when I was in Canada, even in the early 90s, I struggled to get a job because I was white. And I was told by one news director in Toronto that, and I will use the quote because it was seared, "It's a shame your last name isn't Chung, because you would dilute our mix." And I didn't get hired. And he had said all these laudable things about my resume and my background and my abilities, and but he literally said that to me face to face. And I have heard over and over again during my career, not hiring white right now. So I actually feel like I have struggled against that. Not to say that I don't have privilege. I think as a white person in America, I have enjoyed immense privilege that my African American and other colleagues of color have not enjoyed. But me personally, I have actually found it to be a bit of a stumbling block that I'm white.
Let's talk about NewsNation, the network that you're now with. I think most Canadians aren't particularly aware of NewsNation because we don't get it very easily in our country on satellite or cable. And there may well be a number of Americans watching who aren't familiar with NewsNation because the network name is less than a year old. But let me use an old marketing term. Let me ask you, what is the unique selling proposition for NewsNation for potential viewers?
Sure. NewsNation was very alluring to me because it has a mission that should have always been there for everyone, but apparently has gone, and that is to approach news with an unbiased eye and to allow all sides to be on one program. Gone is the day where you have to constantly switch your channels back and forth between media silos to get the other side of the story or the full story. NewsNation really had a mission to give the full story in every show that we do. And so for that reason, I was just beyond over the moon to join an organization like that. Because as a viewer, I absolutely hate the fact that I'm switching around every couple of minutes to hear different versions of the same story.
The three main American networks, if you will, CBS, NBC, ABC, and PBS NewsHour as well, all go to great lengths to ensure that they are unbiased and fair and balanced in their reporting. But on the other hand, Fox News on the right, MSNBC and CNN on the left don't try to hide their particular perspectives. I wonder how you feel, though, whether biased journalism, which we're getting from those networks that I just mentioned, whether that kind of bias is bad for journalism and, for that matter, for public discourse.
I just wish they wouldn't call it news. I think it's absolutely fine to be in a club. I think it's absolutely fine to have a show. But, for God's sake, stop calling it news. and that's been my greatest frustration, is watching this slow slide, first of MSNBC, who, by the way, used to employ a guy named Michael Savage, who had no qualms about calling me a slut on the air. That is a right-wing broadcaster who, on my own airwaves, while I was still employed there, called me a news slut with a big pair of glasses or something like that, and was not punished for it, and I was whisked out of the president's office for even complaining about it. So that was a network that, you know, at the time was not a liberal network and has slid completely into the liberal silo. MSNBC has now had some company with CNN, I believe, as well. They have slid left. Fox has maintained its position. Newsmax has gone way off to the right as well. I mean, thank God for us. I'm going to tout our horn here, because NewsNation does see some market position here that is viable, and we hear all the time that it's refreshing for viewers who feel the same way I do, and that is that I'm tired of switching channels all the time. So I think it's sad. Yes, I think that the news landscape today is sad, because all of these people whose voices are completely legitimate keep calling themselves news, and it's not. It's talk.
You must get approached by an awful lot of younger people, and particularly young women, who ask you for advice, counsel, connections, whatever, for getting into television. What do you say to young people today who want to be the next Ashleigh Banfield?
Well, so it's interesting. I think for a lot of people, the advice is slightly different. So I usually like to know who it is I'm talking to. I don't like to dispense sort of, homogenous advice, although there are a few, solid rules that we could all live by, some golden rules. But I wanted to do something, Jim, instead of an individual half hour or hour that I spend with one person who, for whatever reason, got through to me. I wanted to scale this to be able to talk to a lot more people and not just offer my advice, because I don't think I've had the greatest career trajectory. I think there could have been all sorts of things that I did differently. I wish I were in all sorts of different positions at different times. But what I did was I decided to launch a mentorship program, which is a monthly seminar called Rising Tide. The old JFK expression, a rising tide lifts all boats. I've always believed it. I believe that it is one of the most powerful things in someone's professional career, is to help others, because for whatever reason, the magic comes back to you in spades. So in that way, I'm now able to enlist all these really important people from my Rolodex, all these VIPs of broadcasting, to join me one-on-one every month to answer hundreds of people in the audience their questions specific to their career needs, their career advice, their, the value they see in my guests. And I'm just sort of the interviewer and throw in a few little jewels every so often.
You've been living in the United States for about 25 years, I guess, not quite half your life, but and you became an American citizen in 2008. But I wonder if after all these years, you are still Canadian at heart.
Well, I have the tattoo, which I got before I left, so yes. And yes, it's so funny. I see the Puerto Rican Day Parade in New York City, and I think those folks are still Puerto Rican, even though they're Americans. I see the luck of the Irish, and I see how they brandish their charm, and I think I'm no different. There's no Canada Parade, which I'm frustrated. Maybe I'll have to start that as another hobby. But yeah, first of all, Canada never leaves you, right? I think what you grow up with, that wonderful essence, that community spirit, that Winnipeg thing, the DNA I was talking about, that never leaves you. And I have a Canadian on my staff as well, and we regularly inject some Canadiana into our meetings every day, whether it's just in comedy or whether it's in discourse or whether it's actually opinion. But I think that, Canada is still such a huge part of my life. I insist my children are there for at least a month every year in the summer, so that they get their Canada on and they know their family and they know their roots. And I'm there at least once to twice a year. And, one day I hope to retire and maybe spend, either half of the year in the cold climes of central Canada, and the other half of the year somewhere warm like Florida.
Well, it's every Canadian's God-given right to go to Florida in the winter, so you're given a pass on that one. Has your Canadian upbringing given you, do you think, a different or even unique perspective on your view of the news and the issues, specifically political in the United States?
Well, it's a good question. I think Canadians are slightly agnostic when compared to Americans in politics, because even the most right-wing, Canadian tends to be slightly liberal here in the U.S., generally speaking, of course. I can't brush everyone with the same stroke, but I think that I've been able to bring that sense of balance into who I am here, not only at my kitchen table with my family, but also on the air with my job and then speaking with my staff. Canadians, there's a reason that they're just generally loved around the world. As a whole, they're pretty pleasant people, pretty happy, pretty kind. You walk into an elevator, typically someone will say hello. It's just how we are. I don't know how it works with 35 million people all kind of knowing those, secret society rules, but we bring them with us. We don't lose them. You never can lose them if you spend, my first 27 years or 6 years or so of my life were in Canada. So yeah, it's a big part of who I am.
Ashleigh, that's very well said. And thank you so much for agreeing to do this interview. I know you've got a very busy schedule, but we really appreciate the time.
Thank you, Jim.
And thank you for watching. We hope you'll join us on the next edition of Canada Files.
The preceding program was made possible through the generous support of Ikito Investments, Inc., as well as the following donors: the Browning Watt Foundation, Mary Davey, John and Margaret Deeks, Wendy Deeks, Michael and Mary Ellen Hogan, Ted and Alice Kernahan, David and Cheryl Carr, Philip B. Lind, the Bruce H. Mitchell Foundation, the North Pine Foundation, Francis and Eleanor Shen, the 63 Foundation, and by the Central Canadian Public Television Association.